Greetings, friends, and welcome to our 9th installment of a Bible Refresher in 5. What's in it for you? Reed Bear, pastor and teacher at West Parish of Barnstable, United Church of Christ on Old Cape Cod here. Today I want to talk with you about Christmas, which seems somewhat seasonally appropriate. But first, perhaps paradoxically, I want to talk about George Washington. Now, my two earliest memories of George Washington, who I was told was father of our country, are these. The first is that as a young boy, he thought it would be fun to play with an axe, and he took some delight in chopping down his father's beloved cherry tree. Now, when confronted by his father about the felled tree, George famously owned up to the deed, saying that he couldn't tell a lie. The second was when, as a youth, he took a silver dollar and, in a feat of prodigious athletic ability, hurled it all the way across the Potomac River, which I thought was an incredible waste of money. So, what's the point? Which do you think came first? Washington's rise to prominence as the architect of military victory in the War of Independence and his terms as our first president, or the stories about his promising youth? And beyond that, what was really significant about Washington? Was it his truth-telling and athletic prowess, or was it his military victories and successful presidencies? I think the answer is obvious. The stories about Washington's early days were preserved, some might say invented, because of his significance as the father of our country. Well, in a similar way, I will argue, we should look at the biblical accounts of the birth of Jesus Christ. For what I believe they are all about, the central point they are trying to convey has nothing to do with whether there was actually a census compelling a trip from Nazareth to Bethlehem, or whether Jesus was born in a stable or a house, or whether Mary was indeed a virgin, and so on. The central truth that the biblical authors are trying to convey is what we have come to call the Incarnation. The Incarnation, that in some mysterious ways, which are difficult to convey in words and which are even harder to fully grasp, God made good on age-old prophecies. And instead of watching us from a distance, as the singer Jewel so beautifully puts it in her song, God descended from heavenly abode to take up residence here on earth with us, taking on our flesh, becoming fully human, living and ultimately dying, just as we do. Now, each of the four Gospels try to convey this central, vital truth about Jesus Christ in different ways, in part because they are writing for different audiences, trying to use their languages, their experiences, their background to convey that truth. And so the writer of the first gospel, the one which the scholars tell us predates the other three, Mark tells us that it was at the baptism of Jesus by John the Baptist, when Jesus was an adult, that the Spirit of God descended upon him and thus inaugurated his ministry. And so Matthew, writing for an audience steeped in Jewish tradition and familiar with Hebrew scripture, what we would call the Old Testament, Matthew stresses Jesus' lineage through Joseph all the way back to King David, whose kingdom Jesus will inherit, and all the way back to Abraham, through whom God had promised the whole world would be blessed. Not just the Jews, the whole world. And so, of course, Matthew tells us of the Magi, Gentiles, who come to worship the King of the Jews. And then Luke tells the story with an emphasis on Mary, a peasant girl living in a backwater town in a land ruled by a foreign oppressor, who even so says yes when God tells her she will be the means through which love will be born into the world. Throughout his gospel, Luke stresses Jesus' concern for the poor and the oppressed. And so, of course, Luke tells us of a birth in a stable and a visit by humble shepherds. And finally, we get to John. John's writing for a Greek audience, an audience steeped in philosophy and logic. His nativity story has no Mary, no Joseph, no magi, shepherds, or angels. Instead, he writes, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us." And he speaks of a light that was the light of all people, which came to the earth, which the powers of evil and death have never put out. It's the same story, but stripped down to its essentials: incarnation. Friends, I don't think we have to choose any single nativity account. For me, they tell the same mysterious, wonderful, life-giving story, but all in different ways. What's in the Bible for you? Nothing less than new and abundant life. Hope to see you next week, and God bless you all, everyone.